Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of WTF Science and Beyond. Each week, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about a strange science experiment, a newsworthy sciencey story, or any other happening that makes you wonder what the fuck is going on. I'm your host, Lady Ayla Nicole. Thank you so much for joining me this week. So I promised you all that I was working on the sound, and my husband got me a microphone for Christmas. So hopefully we're gonna get it together here. This is gonna make it all better. So let's get into it. This week we're gonna talk about Sokushinbutu, the horror of Buddhist mummification. Now, I saw some articles say that it wasn't truly mummification because of the process, and then some people started calling it embalming, but they didn't really like that word either because they said there weren't any chemicals per se. So I'm not really sure what to call it. The Buddhist monks knew what to call it, and they called it Sokushinbutu. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to do a whole series on really bizarre religious practices. It started with our episode on head shrinking. If you haven't listened to that one, go check it out. That was kind of the first religious, I don't even know if you'd call it religious, but strange practices. So that kind of gave me the idea. At any rate, I keep getting off. So let's get into it. In northern Japan, amongst the sacred slopes of Mount Udano, lie the shrines of Buddhist monks who transformed themselves into mummies while they were still alive. This practice, known as Sokushinbutu, or Buddhas in their very body, was practiced between 1081 and 1903. Although the Mihai government outlawed it in 1877, they just kept going for another 20 years. Why one would seek to become self-mummified is a bit of a challenge for a lot of people to understand. I think most people, I don't know, it completely blows my mind. I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. So maybe people who are very deeply religious could understand this. I just don't. None of it makes any sense to me, but it's fascinating nonetheless. Sokushinbutu were said to possess both great motivation and great ability to help save people from various afflictions. The farmers of the Shonai Plains region of Japan, where many of the Sokushinbutu originated, suffered from poor harvests, famines, and severe taxes throughout the Tokugawa period from 1600 to 1868. And again, I'm going to apologize for butchering most of the words. When the monks achieved Buddhahood, they believed the sacrificial act would grant them access to Tusita heaven, where they would live for 1.6 million years and be blessed with the ability to protect humans on Earth. Most people in Japan believed in Buddhism's endless cycle of life and rebirth. Usually, it would take an eternity to earn up enough karmic credit to escape the suffering-laden cycle of Rine, or Rini, R-I-N-N-E. Esoteric sect followers, however, believed that it was possible to become a Buddha in a single lifetime if the soul went through rigorous training. This is one of the reasons why there were as many Sokushinbutu attempts as there were. Needing their physical bodies to accompany their spiritual selves into Tusita, they embarked on a journey as devoted as it was painful, mummifying themselves from the inside out to prevent decomposition after death. The process took at least 3 years, its method perfected over centuries and adapted to the humid climate, usually unsuitable for mummifying a body. Which this is the first insane thing. If you know anything about mummification, and I know a very little bit, but it usually has to be a very arid climate in order for it to work. So somehow they've figured out a way to do this in a very humid climate. And religious or not, the amount of knowledge that they had to have to be able to do this is pretty startling. It's impressive. So for 1,000 days, the monk would live on a diet of tree eating. They would go into the forest and forage for tree roots, nuts, berries, tree bark, and pine needles. Some have even reported finding river rocks in the bellies of the monks, and I have to assume that this is from just pure starvation. If you've ever heard the story, really any sort of starvation story, but the one that immediately comes to my mind is the kids in the Andes plane crash, the rugby players, and how they were eating like the foam from the cushions and the chairs of the plane. They said they at one point had tried to eat like the leather belts or shoes or suitcases, and they weren't able to do that because they were treated with the chemicals and things like that. But really, in any starvation scenario, people will eat non-food items just because they have to eat. Some monks were known to repeat this step 2 or 3 times to really prepare themselves for the next step of the journey. So they could be on this tree-eating diet for 8 years, which is completely insane. I know I keep saying that. I'll shut up. There were 2 reasons for this diet. First, it eliminated any fat and muscle from the frame, preparing it for mummification. It also prevented future decomposition by depriving the body's naturally occurring bacteria of vital nutrients and moisture. On a more spiritual level, the extended, isolated quest for food would have a hardening effect on the monk's morale, disciplining him and encouraging contemplation, which I don't know how you would be able to think of anything except eating and getting something to drink. I don't know what else you would be thinking about. It just would take an extraordinary amount of discipline. I wish I knew more about the Buddhist religion. I mean, if you're getting to this point, my assumption is that you have already gone through years and years and years of devotion and meditation before you even get here. Like, you're not just stepping into that. You've already been practicing it for years and years of your life. So after they finish this tree-eating diet, the next step is to begin the embalming process. During this stage, they stopped the tree diet and started drinking things like urishi tea, eating toxic cycad nuts and other various poisonous plants and herbs. So cycads are an ancient group of vascular plants that were once a prominent component of the world's flora. The oldest cycad fossils date to 280 million years ago. In the modern world, they are restricted to tropical and subtropical regions, and they are no longer a dominant plant type. So as a group, they haven't really changed much. They have large compound leaves and often a thick trunk. They superficially resemble palms, but they're not related. They're closely related to the ginkgo tree. Cycad seeds are highly toxic and can cause serious illness if consumed raw. Ingestion of any part of the plant can result in severe poisoning and even death. Signs of poisoning include abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, drowsiness, weakness, coma, seizures, and liver failure. So this is what they're eating. And this is the part where it becomes really fascinating to me, because they knew exactly what they were doing. But in order to gain all this knowledge, you would have to be ingesting these things for how long to know what the effects are If you ate just a tiny bit of it, would the effects not be so severe? It's really, the knowledge is impressive. I don't know what other word to use for it. It's just impressive. So the Urishi tea, which is what they were drinking, it comes from the bark of the Urishi tree, also known as the Japanese varnish tree, or sumac. And the varnish is exactly what it sounds like. They use it to protect their furniture, to put a protective coating on things. So the varnish tree is the most studied species in the genus of Toxicodendron. It's a deciduous tree that can grow up to 66 feet high. The bark is rough and grayish white together with round or heart-shaped large leaves. The flowers are yellowish green. Male flowers are long and slender, and the female flowers are short but thick. The accounts of the results of ingesting Urishi is quite varied. Many sources said that if it is ingested, it has many beneficial medicinal qualities. The trunk, resins, and leaves are the most useful. It is well recognized that the abundance of compounds in the plant is related to their anti-tumor, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and antiviral activities. So again, it's got to go by the amount that you're ingesting, because if they know of all these things and they're using it as medicine, and yet it's having these horrible vomiting, diarrhea, liver failure. A scientific study, a Journal of Anthropharmacology in March of 2021, states that it is quite common in Korea that systemic dermatitis is a result of consumption. After ingestion, 33 patients developed skin lesions such as erythema papules, erythema multiforme, erythroderma purpura wheals, and blisters. Among them, 13 patients, or 52%, exhibited leukocytosis, and 11 patients had elevated eosinophils. The sap from this tree contains toxic and abrasive chemicals that can cause a rash similar to poison ivy. Could you imagine what this is doing internally? Oh, God. So let's talk about some of these symptoms so we can get a better understanding of how horrific this is. Erythema papules appear as a rash of white or yellow papules with blotchy red patches surrounding it. It usually occurs on the trunk, face, and extremities. Papules may have non-infectious fluid inside of them. Erythema multiforme is a skin disorder that's considered to be an allergic reaction to a medicine or an infection. Symptoms are symmetrical, red, raised skin areas that can appear all over the body. Oh, could you imagine getting that between your toes or your fingers? Ugh. Erythroderma, literally red skin, is a severe and potentially life-threatening condition that presents with diffuse erythema and scaling involving all or most of the skin surface area. Purpura. God, I'm so sorry. I have so many problems pronouncing this stuff. Purpura occurs when small blood vessels leak blood under the skin. The smaller version of these are called petechia. Wheals are areas of swelling of the surface of the skin which can turn into red or skin-colored welts. Wheals may get bigger, spread, and join together to form larger areas of flat raised skin, and then blisters are pretty much this, but filled with fluid. By ingesting items that were poisonous, the monks were able to keep off insects that would try to feed off of their corpses. After drinking this tea, they would decrease their consumption to nothing more than a small amount of salinized water. Researchers from the Investigating Committee for Mummies in Japan analyzed the water from the Udono spring and found near fatal levels of arsenic. Aside from acting as a poison, arsenic also remains in the body after death, performing the same task as urishi tea and discouraging insects from taking up residence. They would continue with their meditation practice. As death approached, the devotees would rest in a small, tightly cramped pine box, which fellow votaries would lower into the ground about 10 feet below the earth's surface. Equipped with the bamboo rod as an airway for breathing, monks covered the coffin with charcoal, burying him alive. No thanks. The buried monk was given a small bell, which he would ring to notify others that he was still alive. For days, the buried monk would meditate in total darkness and ring the bell. When the ringing stopped, above-ground monks assumed he had died. They would proceed to seal the tomb, where they would leave the corpse to lie for 1,000 days. After unearthing the coffin, followers would inspect the body for signs of decay. If the bodies had stayed intact, monks believed that the deceased had reached Sokushinbutu. I keep saying Shinbutsu. It's Shinbutsu. Sokushinbutu. Smoke would be used to ensure the longevity of the skin. The bodies would then be dressed in robes and placed in a temple for worship. Monks who were showing signs of decay, the monks would then give them a modest burial. And hundreds of monks attempted to reach Sokushinbutu, but only 16 achieved it. These days, no one practices the act, as the Mihai government criminalized it in 1877, viewing the practice as outdated and depraved. The law prohibited anyone from opening the tomb of a monk who had attempted Sokushinbutu unless the monk had entered the tomb before the law was enacted. The one-eyed monk, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to show respect and I'm just butchering every Japanese word that comes along. The one-eyed monk Tetsu, I'm so sorry. I don't even guess. But there was a one-eyed monk that had been preparing for Sokushinbutu for years when the law was enacted. So he decided to complete his journey anyway and was sealed into the tomb in 1878. At the appointed time after his death, his followers snuck out to his tomb in the middle of the night and disinterred him in secret. Which, I can't really blame them. That's a lot of work to just pour down the drain. I think if I were going to do this, I would want people to see it through, regardless of what the government said. They were overjoyed to discover that he had achieved Sokushinbutu, but then they realized they faced a great dilemma. They couldn't put his body on display in the temple without admitting that they had broken the law by opening his tomb. Ultimately, they decided to alter the temple records to list the date of death as 1862, prior to the ban, and enshrined him at Nangaku Temple, where he remains to this day. Whatever. I'm not going to fault them. That's some crazy. That's pretty nuts. I love that. The last monk to die of Sokushinbutu did so illegally, passing years later in 1903. His name was Bukai, and in 1961, researchers at the Tohoku University would exhume his remains, which now rest in Kanzyoji, a 7th century Buddhist temple in southwest Japan. Of the 16 existing Sokushinbutu in Japan, the majority lie in the Mount Udano region of the Yamagata prefecture. And that's it. That's the process of Sokushinbutu. So thank you for joining me on this week's episode. I forgot to give a warning about when it got gnarly. Not as bad as the head shrinking episode, but I apologize if you got a little further in this than you expected and went, oh God. But if you've been joining me for a while, you know that that's pretty much how it goes. So thank you for joining me today. If you liked this episode, give it a thumbs up, forward it, share it with your friends if you liked it, and with your enemies if you don't. Until next time, this is Lady Ayla Nicole saying, don't try this at home. Bye.